Welcome. Thank you so much for coming, especially on a lovely sunny afternoon we've been having. My name is Jenna Mittelmeier. I'm a senior lecturer in international education based at the University of Manchester. And we are here today to talk about the session, Chinese Students on Campus, Challenges to Inclusion. And the purpose of our discussion today is prompted by the publication of a new book by my colleagues, which I had nothing to do with, which is called Emerging Englishes, China English in Academic Writing. It's written by Alex Barata, Ray He, and Paul Vincent Smith. I'm going to give them a proper introduction in just a second. But the book, I believe, is out now. Yeah, and published by Routledge. So if you're interested in this conversation, please do follow up with the book afterwards. What the book does is provide a really detailed look at the phenomenon of China English as a form of world English, which I'm sure my colleagues will be speaking about and explaining as we go along, focusing specifically on the academic writing of Chinese students within the UK, a topic that's very topical to MCI, but also to Manchester as one of the largest hosts of Chinese international students in the UK. The book and the conversation today is an opportunity for us to interrogate some assumptions about Chinese international students. There has been a lot of really, I think, negative discourses about Chinese international students within existing research and within practice on campus, which often structures them through a deficit framing. And what I mean by that is the tendency to talk about international students generally as students with lower quality skills or students who only experience challenges on campus. These need to be discourses that are interrogated because they're actively harmful and incorrect. The support structures that center from them are often ones which are centered on fixing students. So ignoring their linguistic and cultural heritage in favor of assimilating or integrating in with what is seen as standard English, if we talk about language, within our university campuses. And this book does a really great job of disrupting that narrative and encouraging us to think away from these common framings of international students. So what we'll be talking about today are ways of recognizing world Englishes as valid linguistic forms and encouraging us to approach support for international students through that lens. I'm sure the discussion today will build on this, thinking about how we can create more authentic and meaningful inclusion and recognize the cultural heritage of our students and what they contribute to our communities, both on campus and beyond. So we've got a great panel today. Alex Barata is the ghost, who will join us as soon as he can. But Alex is the lead author of the book and is a reader in education at the University of Manchester, where his work focuses on language and identity, linguistic prejudice, and linguistic rights. We have Ray He here in the middle, if you want to give a wave. Ray is a lecturer in international education at the University of Manchester. Her work takes a cross-cultural psychology lens, looking at international students' mobilities and immobilities, mental health and well-being, and the intersections of language, culture, and identity. On the end, we have Paul Vincent Smith, who is also a lecturer in education at the University of Manchester, and his research interests focus on academic writing, higher education, intercultural communication, and theories of teaching and learning. And then we have two other people here representing the voices of current and former students. So we have Vivian Yaxuan Wang, who is a former international student who studied for a master's degree in international education at the University of Manchester, and her work focuses on Chinese international students, student agency, and intercultural engagement. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Sol Stafford here, who is a final year undergraduate student at the University of Manchester studying Chinese and politics, who has also spent a year in China as an exchange student at Nanjing University. We've got a few discussion questions, and then we're going to open it up to broader questions from within the room. So be keeping your questions in mind as we go along. So I will start first to our panelists with a broad question to the panel to kind of set the tone of our discussion. So I'm curious, what do the panel members think, either from the book or from your own experiences? What are your general reflections on the ways universities approach the inclusion of Chinese students within the UK? I don't know who wants to go first. Yeah, go for it. Use the microphone there.
I mean, I've made some notes, and I mean, when we look at the current sort of geopolitical context, I mean, Chinese students do have a very difficult challenge that they face at university here. I mean, first of all, to state the obvious, right? They're Asian, they look different, so they face issues based on that. But other than that, there is the issue again of like politics, right? You've got students from Korea and Japan, and I don't think that they are burdened with the same kind of issues that Chinese students are. I mean, there's this perception as well that they're like very rich, and in a lot of cases that may be true, but I think that does sort of alienate, or it's a perception that I think a lot of British people have, and I think that kind of others them and pushes them away. But more specifically, I think that, you know, some examples I can think of, people like to talk about very sensitive political topics with Chinese students that they're not equipped to deal with. So I'm talking about things like that often come up, the social credit system, you know, these very simplistic ideas about that, and asking students directly like, oh, what's that like, you know? Or an anecdote I've got is going to Yorkshire, you know, like my hometown, and with 2 Chinese students. And then you have some well-meaning local person coming up and asking them what they think about the Uyghur genocide, which obviously these students are not equipped to deal with these kinds of issues. So I do think we've got some challenges there. Yeah. And I mean, I think Vivian especially has got some good reflections from the perspective of a Chinese student on these kinds of things that they face.
Thank you. Yes, I do. And speaking about like broadly about the university support for Chinese students and inclusion, to be honest, I feel like there is a lot of things outside in the world for us to explore, but I don't feel like I necessarily have any access to it if I'm just sitting in my room and interacting with my Chinese peers I know from my previous life. I feel like the most of the support is about my academic life, of my academic English, how to write my essay, how to interact with other students in the class. But I don't know how to make friends. Like, what kind of English should I use? Because back in China, spoken English has not really been emphasized. And I think I'm very privileged because my spoken English is okay, so I can live a proper life here. But most of my friends, they came here with a willing of make friends, of like explore the world, the new world, but they feel embarrassed because they don't know what to say. They don't know how to act as an individual in this society. So I think there is a gap between like Chinese students' need and what the university offers us. It seems like the university is being very inclusive, but I just don't think the support is directing to Chinese students. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Shall we hear from one of our book editors? And for Alex's benefit, the question we're talking about is about general reflections on the ways universities approach the inclusion of Chinese students. Ray, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'd like to share something. I do agree, and it's also really interesting to hear from students' perspective and see how they perceive the support our staff are trying to create at the university. And I also think it's very important for universities or for us as staff to reflect on how we see our students. Are we seeing them? There are critics from Jenna's own work and other colleagues at MIE, are we seeing students, international students, as cash cows only? And now we transfer from that kind of like understanding to see them as students, as Vivian said, okay, it's more about supporting their academic learning, their academic completion of the degrees, but also can we see them as individuals? Can we see them as epistemic agents that who also bring their own knowledge and skills, their own experiences, their own backgrounds, histories to a new cultural environment, who can make proper contributions? I think how we see them would largely and greatly impact how we interact with them, and also how we expect from them. And this expectation would probably either explicitly or implicitly impact their own motivations and how they see themselves as well, how they engage, how they interact with people and different opportunities. So, for example, I'm not promoting my own work, but it's just really one of the programs that we have been initiating at MIE. It's called Postgraduate Academic Enlightenment Program, which is supported by lots of colleagues. Alex, for example, delivering several sessions as part of this program is really to seeing our students, not only international students, of course, not only Chinese international students, but all students, not just as students, but also as individuals, as developing individuals, and seeing their time with us as a more comprehensive journey, and what we can do, not only limited with their academic learning, but what other supports they may need and how we may support them. And that's how we initiated programs or support since such like this PAE, Postgraduate Academic Enlightenment programs. But I'm sure there would be a lot more things that we can do across universities in the UK and abroad as well. Do you have something?
Yeah. Just maybe the other one. Thanks.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted, I suppose, just to think about this as I always do in terms of the general kind of concept. So what's the concept of inclusion that universities work with? And what's the concept they feel they should be working with? So, for instance, we've heard that there is good inclusion in terms of academic support, but less good inclusion in terms of kind of extra academic support or maybe extracurricular support. So it's in what sense do universities feel they can and should be involved in the inclusion of students? So it's not just inclusion into what I suppose is the thing, inclusion into university life or inclusion into social life. And I think the other thing that Ray talked about, I think, is reflective of my own experience as well. So before I was a lecturer at the university, I was in the administration, I worked in student support, and there was a day when one of my managers came to me and said, Paul, can you think about how do we support international students? And I thought, well, that's a big question. How do we support international students when there are so many of them, of so many different kinds, with so many different experiences? And I think I never really got any further than just what I thought about that day. So I think there are some really kind of large questions. We have to kind of frame things in that way. But I don't know, starting from experiences is good. Starting from, I suppose, the concept of inclusion as well is a necessary thing for us.
Thank you. Sorry I'm late, I was just teaching, but the class content was actually quite relevant. Being a linguist, I come at most of what I do from a linguistic perspective, but not wedded to it, but it's more than just language. Obviously, language and culture are interrelated. You do not need a linguist to tell you that, of course. But I've certainly met some resistance from some of the things I'm arguing for, like an awareness of world Englishes. When we mark students' essays, English comes in more than one variety. As someone once said, English is not owned by anybody. As a native speaker, I do not own English and lease it out to others. Most people who speak it are not native speakers anyway. And so the focus here is China English. And there has been some resistance because it's been seen as political correctness gone mad. Simply because I say we should be more aware as educators of different Englishes. A few disclaimers: that does not mean even I can be expected to know every single variety of English. There's several varieties of Nigerian English and Indian English alone. But we see over the years certain grammatical features and vocabulary and stylistic features which we realize if they come up every single semester, it cannot be an error just because it deviates from standard native speaker English, which is the kind expected for assessment. It must be an innovation because of its predictability. And just today, my Chinese students, one example, it's not really what we covered per se, but we notice a lot of Chinese students when they email their teachers, and you know what I'm going to say, they write in a way which shows my ignorance initially. I thought this is very, I feel embarrassed, I just have to be honest. I find it very obsequious originally. When you're getting emails like, "My dear professor, I'm so sorry to disturb you. Please forgive me for taking your time. Thank you so much for your valuable time." And what I came to realize is, it's nothing to do with being obsequious or being too polite. It's actually just a reflection of what would be expected in that context in China, using Chinese or Putonghua. So when you're writing in your native language, you're reflecting your own culture, obviously. So that's an example, I think, of transfer. You're thinking in Chinese, but you're speaking or writing your email, of course, in English. But the problem is when we say that's negative transfer and saying this is incorrect, just say, "Hi, Alex, thank you, best wishes," whatever. Well, no. So it's not negative or positive. I'd say it's somewhere in the middle. It's neutral. It's just simply reflecting the way that is communicated by Chinese students, reflecting their culture, Confucian influence, in what is, I'm told by my Chinese students, a very hierarchical situation. I mean, I ask the students, where's the teacher? If the teacher's here, and where's the student in China? And they, just keep going, keep going. But of course, to suggest that means that students are disrespected is also a cultural misunderstanding. I don't think it's that black and white. It's just simply a different way of conceptualizing social rank. So just to sum up, what is this for me? What is it all about? It's not about linguistics. It's about just helping Chinese students to feel more included, I suppose, from the perspective not of language per se, of that too, but of culture, and giving them an opportunity to teach the teacher. Because I find when they're given an opportunity to lead, sometimes they, to put it bluntly, come alive, and they're very happy to share. We speak like this or write like this because, and that's good, so we can have two-way learning. Because I've learned a lot from my Chinese students over the years, everything from the divide between urban and rural China in terms of education provision, all the different languages spoken in China. There is no strictly speaking Chinese language. I didn't realize that at first. There's lots of Chinese languages. So I think the two-way learning is one way. And again, this is not political correctness, it's linguistic correctness, I would say. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think that's actually a nice transition into talking more specifically about your book. So your book is arguing about the recognition of China English as a valid form of world English that should be recognized within institutions. But it also sits within a context where its use might be variable, particularly where Chinese students are often navigating assumptions by the university and by staff about their language use, and particularly assumptions that they should use the so-called standard English, however we wish to define that, while studying at a British university. So what are your feelings about what staff can do? And I notice there's a number of staff within the room here today, but what can university staff do to help students with navigating the complex ways they're using world Englishes or standard English in various ways? Yeah, Paul, go ahead.
Thank you. So I think just simply the first answer to that question is awareness. It's staff being aware that, as Alex has just described, when we see particular types of language use in especially the written work of our Chinese learners, that the features they see are not errors. They may diverge from what we understand as a standard English, but these features themselves are standard because they are replicated. They are common to very, very large numbers of people. It is a form of language. So to see, first of all, particular language features, and if you want to see examples, you'll have to buy the book. To see these features not as divergence from, as it were, a British or American English standard of English, but as evidence of a form of English with features in its own right, I think is the first step to understanding what comes next. I think what comes next, of course, is quite challenging because, as Alex says, it's not even that we can talk about perhaps, a China English or a Nigerian English. There may be these regional variations that are then replicated and replicated severally by large groups of people. So there is a challenge there. You know, this is not an easy thing, but I think recognition and awareness is really the first step for staff to thinking about their own practice. Thanks.
I think something we really argue in our book is room. It's room that allows students to voice their knowledge, their skills, you know, what they trying to bring or they can contribute to a different cultural environment or knowledge, how we will understand things differently. I think there's an approach, I suppose you need to buy our books, but really we're promoting a potential approach to enhance the awareness that Paul mentioned. It's a bottom-up approach because, for example, as Paul said about his experience, his manager asked him, how can we support international students? It's kindly top-down because we are thinking, we're trying to imagine what international students may need, what Chinese students may work, or what they may experience, what they like, or what they want. But do we leave the room for us to understand what the students really need? Do we leave the room for students to really voice what they can bring, what they want? So it's, if we can take all potential means, it could be official, formal, or some could be informal or even invisible things that we don't really conscious, but there still could be opportunities for us to understand our students, their cultural backgrounds, or their different needs, like Alex said, when you receive an email from Chinese students, could you take that as an opportunity to understand their cultural backgrounds, understand why they behave in that ways? So if there could be not just awareness, but also take that into the practice, apply that idea into your interactions with Chinese students or other international students as well. Take that opportunity to understand them more and think more, reflect more in your own practice. That could be something quite helpful as well.
Just not much to add to that. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ray. I think it's an opportunity just to engage more. And again, it doesn't have to be from linguistic perspective. There's lots of ways. I come at it from the linguistic side, obviously, because that's what I do. But there's ways that I think as lecturers, we're all collectively expected to engage with students to make sure everyone, home students and international, feel welcomed and integrated and so on. I once had a student who was homesick. And I said, well, where's home? She said, Cheshire. So, I mean, it's quite local, I would say, in comparison. But seriously speaking, they can feel out of sorts and homesick and needing to engage more. So one way we do this is we've had once, a time we got some tea and coffee put together and asked the Chinese students to just come. And we sat in a circle. It was very informal. And just simply asked them what works, what does not work, what would you do differently? And it was the first time that I've seen some students who are quite quiet in class really open up. I mean, you couldn't stop them. You couldn't shut them up. And I mean that in a good way. It was good to see them engaging. And I think what they got out of it, the vibe I got was they were grateful that we gave them a chance to speak and to trust what they had to contribute. This is when the program was called MA Education International. I don't think it was they. Maybe a few said, why do we call it Education International? That doesn't make sense in English, maybe French. International education. There was other things too. And they realized that they were going to see changes maybe after they'd already graduated. But they knew at least they could be responsible for some of the changes that were put forward in the program. So just listening. And again, the last thing I've learned is not to equate silence in class with lack of engagement, because a lot of the Chinese students, there's usually a few, 2 or 3, who will always talk, but there's some who will never say a word. Then again, I reflected on that today. In undergraduate work, I never said a word either. It wasn't cultural. It's because I was shy. I didn't want to speak. I was afraid, petrified if they called on me. So there's going to be lots of reasons. But they were still engaging by, thinking about what's been said, this silent engagement too. So I guess it goes back to the same point I made, just two-way learning. Next.
Thank you. Vivian, would you mind if I call on you directly as our international student on the panel? Is there anything you wish your lecturers or teachers had known or had done differently in your experience?
Yeah. I had a very meaningful experience of interact with one of my professor, Stephen Jones. And after a lecture, I went over and talked to him about my ideas. And at the end, he shakes my hand and asked for my name. And I was like, wait, what's this? What's going on? I'm surprised. And he showed his respect. He respects me, and I was so surprised. And then that is like kind of the way that I adopt the idea of like, oh, we're equal, we're both people. He's not like at the top of the hierarchy, just like you mentioned. But I do think there, like for us, we need like ways to realize that the university staff treat us in such a way, they see us in such a way, but we don't know how. I think there is a gap here.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for letting me call on you specifically. I'm kind of struck in the conversation so far. I think a lot of what we're mentioning is about inequities and unfairness. And I wonder if maybe the panel would like to speak now about whether and how you feel existing approaches to world Englishes in UK universities create unfairness or uncertainties for Chinese international students. A big question, but would anyone like to take it on? Yeah.
I'm just starting here because I can keep this really short. So I think, just to go back to my previous point of awareness, if people are not aware of the features of a language such that it can be called a world language, such that it can be called China English, I think that it's a little bit unfair to kind of pin to those people the idea that they are being unfair to that thing because they're not aware of what the thing is and what it's called. So it's really the same point. We need to bring to people's attention that there is this systematic usage of the systematic features of these languages. And once they are aware, then we can, as it were, judge them on their approach and attitudes to what that thing is. But I think until we get to that stage, it's kind of not maybe fair to judge people exactly on those lines. I mean, that there could still be described some kind of, linguistic chauvinism or kind of unfairness or inequity, or whatever you want to call it. But I think the first step is, what is the nature of the phenomenon is maybe not the best way to call it either, but what's what are the described features of the phenomenon we're interested in that we see at play in the work of our students?
Is it worth maybe for colleagues in the room who might not know what we mean when we say China English, would one of our book authors like to give us a quick rundown by what you mean by that concept?
Alex,
take okay.
Though some would dispute that it's not officially arrived yet, the same way Indian English is or British English, there's a lot of linguists, Chinese and non-Chinese alike, who said that it's official. Maybe not in the sense of, well, not used in textbooks, but it's very unusual for any English in a textbook to be anything other than standard native speaker varieties. So China English has its own rules for grammar, and that's the key word, rule. Chinglish is translation errors. So I've seen in China signs like slip carefully, which is grammatical, but semantically unusual. Then you might see the same sign 2 department stores down, slip and fall down carefully. What makes it Chinglish is the fact it's not uniform. But if everybody in China, or a sizable number across a wide area, are saying things like, the researches, then that is different. Now it's predictable. It's systematic. That's what turns an error into an innovation. So in China English, a lot of our students, there have been many researches. They use terms like mute English. I don't know how to say that in Chinese. Mute English.
哑巴英语.
So, you can speak English. Now, you can't really speak very well, which is not always the case, but you know the grammar. And even the stylistic features, the pragmatic features like what might seem as excessive politeness and deference. So that's what China English is, any variety which is predictable, spoken by a large number, however defined, across a wide area, however defined, would be seen as established, even if it's not been codified officially by the OED or textbooks and newspapers and such.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me call you out on giving some definitions on the cuff. But would anyone else like to pick up the point about uncertainties or unfairness and the lack of recognition of China English? Ray, go ahead.
Yeah, I think as a co-author for the book, my contribution is more because I'm a cross-cultural psychologist, so I investigate with my colleagues about China English, Chinese students' use of English, more from their individual development perspective and seeing how they put this as part of their acculturation experience. I know that in either general understanding or academia, there are different understanding towards the word acculturation, and many people feel like it's more about you expect them to adjust to the standard English or adjust to the host cultural environment or standards. But what we really argue in the book is acculturation is a more neutral term, and it's more about the process that allowing the sojourners, that's our Chinese students, Chinese international students, to negotiate, to manage, to interact with a different culture, with their own. And I think it's very important for us to understand that potential power dynamic within this process and take this as a process rather than an outcome or expectation. So if we expect our Chinese students or other international students to adjust or adapt to the certain standards or what are the kind of like a general or widely accepted behavior or the ways of doing things or thinking in the host country, that could be problematic. But again, it goes back to what we discussed before. If we allow the room for these potential innovations linguistically or other contributions that our international students can bring from their like home cultures or their own experiences, we see them as individuals, not just someone come here to learn our way of doing our things. That will be something very important.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, back to Paul. Yeah, of course.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Sol. Just to pick up on that idea of researches that Alex mentioned. So the plural of researches, which is not really that much of an accepted usage. I think actually until recently, we'd be more tempted to talk about, some research projects, some items of research or whatever, to add a kind of a countable noun into that. But of course, in English, researches is a kind of an archaic or literary type of usage. You might see it in Dr. Johnson or kind of much older British authors, and I think he's actually making a comeback. And of course, these things, the innovations that Alex talks about. So the way that language changes, it doesn't change in a vacuum. So we're never really quite sure when the innovations of Chinese learners are going to enter English language discourses more generally. So that's why now, we talk about, was it Tiger Mom, red envelope, and all these kinds of other kind of terrific phrases that we get from Chinese. But researches, I remember receiving, actually, Jenna, you sent us an email to the department, and you said something like, tell us about your researches. Like, not your research? Researches. So there we go. I don't know if you've been influenced by our Chinese students or something has happened, but ever since then, whenever I'm marking and I see researches, I think I cannot actually, in good faith, mark this as a mistake, because we're all starting to use it for whatever reason.
I had no idea I'd ever used that word, so it's a good example. Yeah, of course.
I just remembered also, I know Chinese students, and probably Chinese in general, but certainly at the student level, use the term major, which is used in the States. Obviously, Canada, I don't know. To me, obviously, what are you studying? What's your major? And I think it's Chinese students who might innovate this in Britain more than anybody else, because there's probably a lot more Chinese students than American students in Britain. So hearing this, what's your major? My major is, as opposed to British English, I don't know. What are you studying? Or if you want to be posh, what are you reading? So the fact it may have been borrowed from American English, we borrow lots of words, we never give them back. So China English, that is a legitimate word, because it's not, unlike Chinglish, it is not random. Every single Chinese student I've had, if they have a need to use that word, they would say, what is your major? My major is, I'm changing my major, et cetera, et cetera. When I applied for a visa to go to China, on the government website, it even asked me, what was your major? So we can say, well, look, and if the government website uses that term, that's about as official as you can get. What I would argue is, we don't need a website, government or not, to codify language. People are doing that on the ground level. yes, it's nice if it can appear in an edited book or any kind of edited publication like a newspaper, textbook. Wow, now we're really talking. But standard English is always going to be in textbooks. As someone once said, standard English in the pecking order has the sharpest beak. So that even means non-standard native speaker Englishes don't get a lot of respect too.
In the nature of time, I'm going to open up the floor in just a minute, but I wonder if any of our two speakers, Sol or Vivian, do you have any thoughts about encountered or experienced inequalities regarding language in the classroom?
Well, regarding language, I'd maybe, is it okay if I answer the question in a more sort of broad sense that just talks about inequalities, maybe more general, maybe more sort of, if I can shoehorn this in, just more generally about on campus and some of the issues that I've noticed generally that relate to Chinese students, English, use of English or not, maybe just the way issues with integration. I think you guys focus in the book, obviously, a lot about the Englishes that people use. And then what you've just been saying, and please forgive me if I've misinterpreted this, it's more about how we should, as an institution and as academics, maybe be prepared for how people use different Englishes. And I think that's incredibly important. And I want to kind of segue from that and discuss the dual, there's a relationship. There's the student and then there's the institution. As far as I see it, I mean, I'm not an academic, please cut me off if you really disagree, but I see it as a relationship. And if we look at it as a relationship, we have the students on one hand, and they have a role, and I also think the university has a role. And if we look at the university, I mean, the university does some things incredibly well. If I look at my own experience in China, and I think anybody who's studied an East Asian or Asian language, or maybe a language of a culture that is more insular and doesn't have as many immigrants, you've probably experienced going to that country and living there. And I think there's an onus on you as an individual to maybe push yourself culturally, and there isn't as much support for you. So I know what it feels like to not be supported in my use of a foreign language, or just generally living in another culture. So I understand how important it is. But I also think that there is an argument potentially to be made here about the role of the individual, and maybe sort of bring in the idea of clustering or potentially self-segregation. And just to sort of back that up, the things that the university does well here is like, well, I don't think, so for example, the Manchester-China Friendship Program, and there's obviously lots of initiatives on campus. I mean, they could be communicated better. But one of the big problems that I've observed and experienced myself is that with student societies, more sort of grassroots initiatives that try to get students together and maybe bridge some of these gaps that you talk about here. Obviously you talk about it in terms of the different Englishes, but also these cultural gaps. There are lots of ostensibly cultural integration societies on campus, but they only use Mandarin. So the committees are all Chinese. They use Mandarin materials in their promotion of the societies, and having tried to join these societies, they aren't very accepting to non-Chinese members. And I even tried to create a society at the university that aims to sort of improve integration between students, and maybe integration is not the correct word, but sort of just get people together, experience each other's cultures at just a really grassroots, no sort of agenda there, just basically like get together, have a drink, talk about each other's lives, experiences, these sorts of things. But that actually was blocked by the university because of the existence of these other societies that were created with the same goal, except that I would argue maybe they don't achieve that. So I think that, my overall point here is that maybe we need to think about the institution, and then maybe also maybe bring the individual. I'm not sure how much you would agree, but maybe also bring the individual into this and sort of say, what role do each of these partners in this relationship have? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts.
Yeah, I do agree with you. And also, like, we were working together trying to build a, which is called Mandarin and English culture. What is that called again? Mandarin English Culture and Language Society. Yes. And the university said, because we have Chinese Integration Society, Language Society, so that your mission has been like covered, which is not true, because there is no integration, real integration or interaction or engagement in the Chinese society that already existed. British students who are trying to join the Chinese Integration Society got rejected, or they are not encouraged to join. And also, I think universities and students should both take responsibilities in this process, in the engagement process, because I can also observe that in the classroom, the lecturers are really understanding that we're speaking Mandarin. We might have difficulties to speak English, but Chinese students are also trying to just speak Mandarin in international social settings. For example, when there are local students or international students who cannot understand Mandarin, Chinese students still speak Mandarin with each other to communicate about some important information, which I think that is Chinese students' responsibility to achieve creating or engaging in the inclusive environment.
Thank you. Book authors, any final words before I open up to the floor? Anything you wanted to say and haven't had a chance to yet? No, all has been said.